Hello everyone. So I'm here today to talk about The Essex Serpent, which was one of the books I talked about in my June book haul a week ago. I write notes as I read books because it gives me something useful to say, and I have lost my notes on this. So what you are getting is what I can remember, which I hope makes sense, and apologies if it doesn't. Go look at one of my other videos where I actually had some notes that maybe made a bit more sense, or maybe didn't, you tell me. But The Essex Serpent. So I think I said in my video a week or so ago that historical fiction is not really my thing. So this book I picked up because it had been so hyped that it was beginning to feel churlish of me not to actually get on and read it. It was Waterstone's Book of the Year last year. I think Waterstones have, which is a book chain in the UK, have sold about 70% of the copies that have been sold. So they've been an immensely supportive bookseller for Sarah Perry and for The Essex Serpent. And I've been seeing it everywhere. I finally decided to read it. So The Essex Serpent it's a historical novel. It's set in the late 19th century. It starts on the day that a woman, Cora, attends the funeral of her husband. So it starts with a widowed, youngish woman starting on the next phase of her life. And she is a woman with intellectual interests that go beyond the typical Victorian woman. She's interested in archaeology, she's interested in anatomy, she's interested in going and finding fossils, and she's interested in the rumours she hears about this beast called the Essex Serpent. So the novel is set between London, where she comes from, where she moves back to at one stage, and the village in Essex where the serpent is supposed to have been seen. And really, so there are quite a lot of very significant characters in this book, all with very interesting things to say and points of view and interests, really. I mean, it varies from somebody performing heart surgery of a type that hasn't been done before, so very innovative, slightly risky heart surgery for the first time. There is Cora, who is fairly atheist, I think we can probably assume from our modern standpoint. There is William, who is a preacher in this small village in Essex, so who has a traditional Christian view of the world, which can't quite accept Darwinism and science and all of these things which are burgeoning in the late 19th century and changing the way the world begins to think. It's a very interesting book about religion and science in the 19th century by A.M. Wilson, I think called God's Funeral, just as an aside, if anyone is interested to read that, which I read many years ago and which has stuck with me. In fact, it's a very, very interesting book. And so The Essex Serpent is at the middle of a lot of these Victorian preoccupations. It is set, as I said, between London and between the village in Essex, which is where William, the pastor, lives with his family, wife and son and daughter. And it takes in a wide range of characters. So there is Cora, the recent widow, and William are probably the main characters, but there's also Cora's friend, the surgeon, known as the Imp, for the way he looks. There is Cora's son, Francis. There is the Imp's friend. There's Cora's companion, Martha. And then William, as I say, has a wife and two children, and various other people within the context of the village also become important characters in the book. And the serpent itself, of course, is this haunting character throughout. So it's got a wide cast, it's got a wide scope intellectually and in terms of people. And it's an extremely enjoyable book. I really enjoyed reading it. It has a strong story. There is always the question in our minds of, is the serpent real? Is it going to be found? Is it going to turn out to be one of the living dinosaurs that Cora desperately wants to find so she can get her name on a plaque in the British Museum? All of this tension is there throughout, and also the village is consumed by this idea that the serpent is bringing them bad luck, and that's the cause of the crop failures, the illnesses, the children dying, the bodies which every so often are washed up on the beach, the rumours that are spreading around. So there's a sense of supernatural happenings in the village, which William the pastor is responsible for trying to calm, trying to push the superstition away, trying to bring people back to his God, at the same time as Cora is almost excited by all of these ideas that are floating around. So there's quite an interesting dynamic between Cora and William, which I won't go into in too much detail because that would be spoiler territory. But in terms of their clashing worldviews coming together and what that then says about Victorian England and how that propels the story. As I say, it's a very enjoyable read. It's not my sort of book, which I knew, well, I suspected in advance it probably wouldn't be, but let me just try and explain a little bit why. So historical fiction I tend to think that if you're going to set fiction, if you're going to make the active decision as a writer to set fiction in the past rather than in the present, then there has to be some sort of reason for that. And I think that means it has to comment in some way on the present in an interesting way. Now, not all writers would say this, not all readers would say this, that's fine, but this is my view for what it's worth. And I didn't particularly feel that this novel did that. It says interesting things, it picks up these Victorian themes, as I said, it brings them together in a way that propels the story forwards, that develops these interesting characters. But I didn't feel at any stage that modern London or modern superstition or modern religion or modern science were being commented on in any way. There didn't seem to be a particular purpose behind it. And when I read historical fiction, I tend to look for that purpose in some ways. I also found that the main characters were not that compelling for me, which is interesting. I mean, Cora is a modern woman with a mind of her own, trying to make her way in a world of men after the death of her husband, and in that sense is a very modern feminist character. She didn't. My heart didn't sort of pull for her as she found herself in all of these different situations. She was described, and I was expecting more from Cora, I think, because she has been so highly praised by so many reviewers. And the Washington Post, I think I said this before, the Washington Post described her as the most charming character since Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, which is a high bar, but she didn't meet that bar for me. Maybe she did for other people. But actually, the character I was most compelled by was her son Francis, who I found. So Francis is, I guess, in modern terms, somewhere on some sort of autistic spectrum. He doesn't relate naturally with other characters. He has a lot of odd preoccupations. He collects things, he labels things, he puts things in order sort of incessantly. His mother finds it very hard to be warm with him. It's a very awkward relationship. But almost because of his awkwardness, some of the sections with Francis were for me the most compelling parts of the novel. And I just want to read you this section, which is of Francis with a man, an old man who has come to the natural end of his life, who has had a heart attack, collapsed on the beach, and is lying there on the beach, desperate for somebody to spend his last moments with him. And what he wants to have with him is the kindly preacher who hasn't always agreed with him, but who has been the kindly feature in his village for all of this time. And what he gets instead is this young, slightly autistic boy who doesn't react in the same way that other people around him are reacting. So this is what happens. Cracknell is the man, and he's lying on the beach. "Get someone," said Cracknell, and after that fell to muttering at length, exasperated or amused, fixing Francis with an imploring and furious glare. Francis crouched and, clasping his knees, surveyed Cracknell with mild interest. A moth had settled in the fibres of the coat's fur collar, and elsewhere the fabric showed patches of pale stains that might even have been mould. Could moulds take hold on clothing? Francis resolved to find out. "Ransom," said Cracknell, who is the preacher, who did not quite want to make his last confession, but wouldn't have minded a kind face being the last he looked on. He put out a hand to tug the boy's coat. "Please," he meant to say, but the effort was too great. The boy tilted his head and took in the name. Ransom, he said. He supposed that made sense. The man with the white strip at his throat had visited 3 villagers in the past weeks, he had counted, of whom at least 2 had died. Did he bring death, or only ease them into it? He assumed the latter, but it was important to be sure. Examining the old man, Francis saw foam gather at the corners of his mouth and his chest rear inside his coat. Even in the near dark, it was possible to see the man's flesh take on a waxy cast, and already the bones of the sockets showed blue around his sinking eyes. It was both frightening and commonplace. Probably this was always the way the end came. Cracknell discovered he could not speak. It would waste the breath he eked out of the cool air. What was the boy doing, crouching placidly behind him, turning now and then to look up and smiling every time he did it? His heart lurched in its cavity. Surely he'd go running now and fetch Ransom, who'd come with a lamp and a good thick blanket to lay over his shaking limbs. But Francis, who knew what was coming, saw no sense in wasting time. Besides, it struck him that sharing the wonder that all the while unfurled over their heads might not halve his own pleasure, but double it. He stooped over the man and said, "Look," and taking a handful of grey hair, tugged at his drooping head, so that Cracknell had no choice but to turn away from the black water and up to what he'd once thought was the heavens. "Look," said the boy, "see." And he saw the old man's filmy eyes widen and his mouth gape. The shining scraps of cloud were fading as the dawn came, but had gathered into a pale arc that split the sky, and as they watched, a skylark flew up ecstatically singing. Then Francis lay beside him on the marsh, not caring for the mud that seeped through his clothes, or for the reek that came off the old man's body, or the morning chill. Their 2 heads touched now and then, as Cracknell, dazed, turned his head to take in the sight, sometimes trying out a scrap of a hymn. "It is well with my soul," he sang, doubting it less now than ever. When the life went out of him, it was on a long, untroubled breath, and Francis patted his hand and said, "There, there," feeling quite satisfied, because what he loved above anything else was for things to go as he'd thought they would. Now that to me is one of the most poignant chapters or sections of this novel. There are another couple I could have chosen, also involving Francis. So for me, Francis was really the exciting character. I think because I'm interested in writers who make us see the world in a different way. And Sarah Perry does partly do this by taking us back into 19th century England, but by taking us into the mind of this rather odd child, Francis, and helping us understand what's important to him. To me, that was the way in which this novel stood out and expanded my view of the world. So, The Essex Serpent. Let me know what you think. I enjoyed it, despite it not being my sort of book. I shall doubtless buy it and give it to people over the next year or so as birthdays and Christmas come round. Let me know what you think. Goodbye for now.